Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you all are hearing us well, and that you are staying well wherever you're joining us from. My name is Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez. I'm a professor at the University of Denver College of Law. And on behalf of a number of units at the University of Denver, the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Study of Inequality, or IRISE, the Rocky Mountain Collective on Race, Place, and Law, and the Crimmigration Law and Policy event series, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to a virtual conversation with Professor Ian Haney Lopez. Later, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A function that should appear at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so I encourage you to be thinking about those and to be sharing those. But first, I want to turn things over to my colleague, Tanya Valdez, a clinical fellow in the University of Denver's Immigration Law and Policy Clinic, where she oversees students who provide legal representation to migrants in the immigration courts and in the federal court system as well. Professor Valdez's research interests currently center on the contested role of the privilege against self-incrimination, the constitutional privilege, in immigration court proceedings. But before joining the University of Denver, Professor Valdez was a civil rights lawyer. She was a staff attorney at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and she was also a law clerk for a magistrate judge, a mix of the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado. We welcome our guest, Professor Ian Haney Lopez. Let me now turn things over to Professor Valdez.
Thank you so much for that intro, Cesar, and thanks for inviting me to have this conversation with Professor Haney Lopez today. So I have the pleasure of introducing and chatting with Professor Ian Haney Lopez. He is currently the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He's one of the leading thinkers on how racism has evolved since the civil rights era, and his current research emphasizes the connection between racial divisions in society and growing wealth inequality in the United States. And although he's written several books, his talk today is focused on two books. So a 2014 book called Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class, and his most recent book, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America. Quite an ambitious title, Ian. So before we get rolling, I wanted to cover a couple logistical things. So we were supposed to be having a Facebook live stream today, but unfortunately we had technical difficulties. So we'll have to post the video after this event. And for folks who are attending live, please feel free to post any questions that you have about the discussion into the Q&A function, as Cesar mentioned. So first, Ian, I want to thank you for making time to join us in these truly unprecedented times. Both of our states, I'm in Colorado, Ian's in California, both of our states are literally on fire right now, adding even more meaning to everyone calling 2020 the true dumpster fire of a year, right? And then, as of last night, we have a new Supreme Court justice. The election is 7 days away. And amid all of that, here we are talking about the best way forward. So let me just say that I learned a tremendous amount from your book, Merge Left. It left me feeling hopeful in not the most hopeful of years. And I highly recommend to our audience to get that and read it. So where I'd like to focus most today is on a theme that you build into the preface of your book, which is, and I quote, "The best response to divide and conquer is unite and build." So I'll dive into the first question here because we're academics and academics love defining things with a definition. So can you just tell us some about what you mean by dog whistles or by dog whistle politics, which is the title of your previous book? And in this definition of dog whistle, how are people of color included or excluded from that conversation about dog whistles, both in terms of who they target and how those messages are received by people of color?
Yeah, great questions. Well, first, let me say thank you to Cesar and thank you to you, Tanya, for hosting this conversation, and to DU for inviting me as an institution to participate in this conversation with you folks. Really, really delighted. And like you say, this is a sort of a tumultuous time, a treacherous time. So delighted we could all come together and talk about these things. I do think that um, what I want to try and advance, and what you see in Merge Left, is both a dire analysis of what has happened to us as a country over the last 50 years, um, and then, but also. It's a dire analysis that has pretty hopeful implications in terms of what we can do to um, respond to the basic threats that we face, and create a sort of a society in which all of us feel secure, live with dignity, have the best possible opportunity to thrive. So hopefully we'll be able to convey both the dire analysis, but also a hopeful way forward. But I think you're so right to begin with the question: what is dog whistle politics? So, dog whistle politics is a way to simultaneously stoke fears and resentments deeply connected to racism, and yet to do so in a manner that allows plausible deniability. And I'll come back and I'll say a little bit more about that dynamic in a second. Um, Let me start, though, by saying dog whistle politics is what we've been living since 1963. So dog whistling is this effort to have a conversation, to build um, American electoral competition around a conversation about the position of whites in our society, but to do so in a way that's coded. So the first thing to notice is this isn't 1963 doesn't mark the year in which the position of whites and the importance of whiteness and white supremacy and white dominance, that doesn't mark the year they come into politics. They've been central to politics since debates about slavery and about manifest destiny and empire. Rather, 1963 marks the year in which those conversations go underground. They begin to take the shape of code. And so this is what we mean by the rise of dog whistle politics. Not the first appearance of racism as a central organizing principle in American politics, but rather the sublimation of racism into a coded conversation. Okay, what do those codes look like? In 1963, they looked like states' rights. So states' rights on its surface makes no reference to race. That's the code. But of course, in 1963, everyone understood that states' rights meant the right of Southern states to continue to use their laws, their government organization, their governments, and their customs to subordinate and humiliate African Americans, as against Brown versus Board of Education and a federal move ordering Southern states to cease using state force to suppress and humiliate African Americans. So that's what states' rights meant. From there, you get law and order, thugs, welfare queens, the sort of Muslim terrorists, illegal aliens. Law and orders come back, illegals have come back, China virus. Like on their surface, none of these terms are racially explicit. Certainly, none of them speak expressly in a language of white supremacy or white dominance or use racial epithets. And yet they all trigger, are designed to trigger fears and resentments rooted in racist stereotypes. And let me pause there just for a second. Many people understand the term dog whistle politics in terms of the metaphor itself. And so a literal dog whistle is a whistle that blows at such a high frequency that human ears can't hear it, but dogs can. And so a lot of people take the metaphor, and by a lot of people, I mean including a lot of journalists, for instance, understand the metaphor to be one merely of coded speech. And it's certainly coded, but that misses the most important, the most democratically threatening aspect of dog whistling. So to give you an example of what I mean, Barack Obama, in addressing an African-American audience at one point used the phrase, "we shall overcome." And some journalists responded by saying, "Oh, he's dog whistling to African Americans because we shall overcome has a special resonance. It recalls some of the civil rights anthems. It recalls some of the speeches by Martin Luther King. That has a special reference for African Americans it doesn't have with whites." So surely that's right. But does it really make sense to say that when Barack Obama invokes "we shall overcome," he's dog whistling in the same way that Donald Trump is dog whistling when he talks about caravans of immigrants and murderers and rapists coming across the border, right? These two are very different things. What distinguishes them? When Donald Trump dog whistles, he's using code to hide the fact that he's intentionally triggering fears and resentments rooted in racist hatred. Whereas, Barack Obama is in a sense doing the opposite. He's calling for a fight against racism, for a move towards racial egalitarianism. Yes, using language that has different resonances for different racial groups, but in no way seeking to stir racial hatred. Right? So it's very important to be clear that what makes dog whistling is not merely the use of code, but the use of code to trigger fears and resentments that are ultimately rooted in racist stereotypes about who is dangerous and undeserving, as opposed to who is innocent and deserving and hardworking.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think it's just really helpful to lay that groundwork for where we're going in this conversation, just so that we're all on the same page with this. Just in looking at the folks who registered for this event and who are on here, we have people from labor and union type organizing, other types of organizers like college students, law students, faculty. So just to draw everybody together in understanding this definition. So how did you get from dog whistle politics to the concepts underlying merge left?
Actually, let's start before then, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
So this is I'm guessing that most people on this call understand racism today the way I understood racism for many years. So I really became a student of racism when I was in graduate school, both in public policy, but especially in law school. And I was very fortunate to study with Derek Bell, and really came to think about racism as a hierarchy of whites over non-whites, and racism itself as an ideological system, the set of ideas that justified but also grew out of a supposed hierarchy of superior whites over inferior people of color. That's really how I was thinking about racism. Then we get to 2008, Barack Obama and his election. And, it was obvious to me, as I'm sure obvious to most people on this call, 2008 didn't mark the era in which suddenly the country was post-racial or beyond racism, the way Obama's election was so often celebrated. But it did destabilize, it did challenge my thinking on racism, because I could see that mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration, was continuing against African Americans, right? So racialized mass incarceration is this system of arresting and removing and caging people, especially from African American, though also from Latino communities. It really gets its start in the early 1970s. It's enormous, it's monstrous, it's having these devastating consequences on people of color. Put in a slightly more abstract language, it's the massive deployment of government violence against communities of color. So now we get to 2008 and the election of a Black president who I know is racially progressive, He and I actually overlapped in law school. You know, he's a brilliant thinker, very sophisticated understandings of race and racism. And yet this massive government violence against communities of color, especially against the African-American communities, is continuing. And then the puzzle becomes even more challenging. Not only is the Obama administration continuing racialized mass incarceration, but it very quickly begins to assemble the machinery of mass deportation, right? It begins to deport people at historic levels, like higher than anybody ever before in the history of the country on a sustained basis. And here again, it's a machinery that is disproportionately targeting communities of color. The Obama administration is deporting more Latinos than they constitute a proportion of those who are undocumented in this country. They are systematically targeting Latinos, and they're not racist in this this conception of racism that I was operating under, white over non-white hierarchy. In other words, my understanding of racism couldn't explain why the government under Barack Obama was continuing to target African-American and Latino communities and building new machinery of racial oppression against Latinos. I needed some other explanation, not just to understand what was happening, but I realized that if I didn't understand what was happening, I couldn't possibly articulate a way forward. Right? Like, how are we going to solve this if our basic understanding, our basic story of where this is coming from is incomplete in some important way? And this really pushed me to recognize that the racism driving mass incarceration and mass deportation was actually normal politics. And by describing it as normal politics for the United States, I don't mean politics and therefore not racism. I mean that it became apparent that racism had been normalized into electoral politics. In other words, it was dog whistle politics. It was politicians using stories rooted in racist narratives who were driving mass incarceration and mass deportation. When politicians from Barry Goldwater to Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan to Bill Clinton warned about crime and lawbreakers and insisted on law and order and getting tough on crime and a war on drugs, they didn't just use that rhetoric on the campaign trail. They turned around and governed in a way that simultaneously seemed to fulfill their promise. You know, I said, I'll be tough on crime and I'm going to build prisons. But in addition, more cynically, cracking down on crime created the evidence that they would then use to justify the war on crime, right? It became circular. They created a spectacle of criminality in order to justify the very racist stories they were telling about people of color as inherently violent and criminal. Likewise, that's what Obama and even more so Donald Trump has done in terms of deportation, both fulfilling a campaign promise to crack down on these supposedly dangerous people, but also creating the spectacle that seemingly proves how dangerous they are. Every time you see, and George W. Bush did this too, these raids on immigrants, and it's SWAT teams and helicopters and and ICE, and they're showing up and they're loaded with automatic weapons, that creates a theater of dangerous people in order to give weight to the lie that in fact we are all being threatened by Black and brown communities, right? So this is the shift that I underwent that drives me from a prior conception of racism as fundamentally whites against people of color to a new understanding of racism as normal politics. And here I'll just make this point and then I'll stop. Normal politics, not simply in a sense of, hey, politicians are using race to win election, but normal politics in the sense of saying, this is especially the tactic of the party that used to be known as the party of big business. In other words, the Republican Party especially has used race to create popular support for a form of government that primarily helps the very rich. And nobody better symbolizes this than the claimed billionaire Donald Trump. Right? Like if you look at what he's done on a policy level, he's passed massive tax cuts for the very rich and for corporations, and also demonized immigrants and started his much ballyhooed wall, right? And these two are the same thing. They're the flip sides of the same coin. To use racism to build support for a government that primarily works for the very wealthy.
Yeah, I just, in hearing you talk about how like the law and order of arresting and incarcerating people just proves the point that certain people in society are lawbreakers and they're criminals and all that. It just makes me think, as an immigration attorney who's teaching law students every day about how to be effective immigration attorneys and operating in a system that is so deeply unfair, and just seeing this progression of like the continued narrative of the criminal alien, and then that prosecutions have been skyrocketing at the border for people, for illegal entry and re-entry, which has led to the family separation. And yeah, it just is so true. And it's just a helpful way to think about race and how that ties into these larger objectives of funneling money to the most wealthy.
Yeah, I want to say, I want to acknowledge the sort of real racism as bigotry that's there, while also keeping our eyes on the way in which, on another level, this is just cold strategy. So,
right.
So the racism is there in a person of in a person like Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller isn't just doing this as strategy. He's not just doing this to scare the public. He has significant ties to white nationalism. He seems to be making decisions that really are rooted in a genuinely held conviction that people of color are inferior racially and a threat to the country, right? Like this guy, like if you wanted to recuperate this idea of like, hey, some of them are just bigots, yeah, that's Stephen Miller, and he's building policy on that level. What about someone like Donald Trump? I think Donald Trump also has, bigoted, racist, white supremacist beliefs, but Donald Trump is different than Stephen Miller. Trump is much more of a strategic opportunist in the way he presents himself publicly, politically. Part of the way we can see this is Donald Trump ran for president initially in the year 2000 as a political liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was responding to efforts by Patrick Buchanan to stir up hatred against immigrants, Donald Trump responded to that by saying, that's disgusting, that's un-American, this guy's a Nazi, right? Like Donald Trump understands the power of racism as a political strategy. He initially opposed it, and now he's embraced it, right? So he's much more strategic. I want to emphasize that racism is foundationally driven by the strategy of these powerful elites, that it is fundamentally about or driven by, supported by, promoted by powerful elites like Donald Trump, but also like the Mercers, Wall Street financiers who ended up bankrolling Breitbart and Steve Bannon, the Kochs, petrochemical tycoons who fund Americans for Prosperity, that in turn funds the Tea Party. Right? These are very powerful elites who are systematically, strategically promoting racial hatred because they understand that when Americans fear each other, when we fear our neighbors, we're less able to stand up to the power of concentrated wealth. But I don't want to imply that that's all there is. That sort of strategy empowers white nationalists like Stephen Miller, but it also rewards and foments a culture of racism in our government institutions. And here I think we need to think about ICE, right? Like it's not that ICE by itself is driven by racism against people of color, anti-Latino racism, anti-Asian racism. Rather, it's that our political leaders have demanded of ICE that as an institution, it engage in targeted violence against communities of color. And that sort of institutional role has helped further and has encouraged racism among ICE agents themselves, right? Like being comfortable with, being committed to violent dehumanization of people of color is what is rewarded within that institution, right? And so this is this complex relationship where the primary engine of this is concentrated wealth, party of big business, people like the Kochs and the Mercers and the Trumps. But the result of it is racism that it becomes institutionalized within the government, the empowerment of white nationalists within the government, and also a political rhetoric that spreads the idea of white superiority through the populace at large, right? That's the campaign rhetoric that not just Trump, but almost every elected Republican or every Republican electoral candidate promulgates.
Yeah, just as you were talking about how ICE is structured and like brings everyone into this racial narrative that just is for the purpose of furthering the agency's mission as a whole. It also made me think of Immigration Nation, that Netflix show, where in the first episode, they show a bunch of raid scenes, and someone at some point comments that it's the bureaucracy of that agency that is also an effective tool in carrying out what they're doing. So they've combined this racial anxiety and stoking that among people who work there. And then also they're all just part of a bureaucracy. So each person just does their own individual part and doesn't have to think about the trauma impacting people that they're apprehending as a whole.
They are encouraged to act in a dehumanizing way, and I think we can extend this also to the police and to this and what's happening to Black and brown people in terms of the police murder of Black and brown people. One story we tell is there are racist cops and there's a culture of racism among the police. And that is true. But that's not where this is coming from primarily. Another story we tell is, oh, this is rooted in slavery and then in Jim Crow. And that is true too. I mean, you can really see a history of violent policing emerging out of the policing of people seeking to escape from enslavement, right? So that is true too. But again, the level of police violence against Black and brown communities is not primarily vestigial, primarily a sort of a holdover effect from slavery and Jim Crow. Rather, since Richard Nixon, politicians at the federal level and then increasingly at the state level have been promoting the idea that people of color are dangerous and that the role of the police is to protect society from those dangerous people,
Mhm.
And that the role of prisons is not rehabilitation, but incapacitation, that the best thing we can do is remove these supposedly dangerous people from society. And that since these people are so dangerous, we ought to not see the police as social workers. We should instead see them as the military, as lawful agents of violence within our own society. And so we've taken the racism that is ambient in our society, and we've built an institution that actually asks people to be racist, asks people to see people of color as inherently dangerous, as super predators, as capable, indifferent to pain, as drug addled, as rapists and murderers. And then it says, go out and control those people and use your military training. And here are some assault rifles. And by the way, here's all of this, here's these armored personnel carriers that we last used in Iraq. You can use those too, right? Right? Like, what killed George Floyd? Yeah, in one way, it was the racism of the police officer kneeling on his throat, but more fundamentally, it was Richard Nixon. It was Ronald Reagan. It was Bill Clinton. It was George H.W. Bush and his war on drugs. It was all of those politicians saying repeatedly, people of color, we got to control the thugs. We got to restore law and order. We got to crack down on crime. And then they built a culture and they built an institution, and they built a culture that was willing to engage in that sort of dehumanizing, barbarous violence.
Mic drop, Ian. Mic drop. Yeah, I mean, it's insidious, right? And it impacts every one of our institutions and our daily lives. And, we're sitting here talking about race and going into all this, but you also talked in your book about how there's this idea that talking about race is racist. And I think you alluded to this too in your intro when you were talking about how Obama talking about, we shall overcome, isn't inciting racial fear, right? Like that's not the purpose of that, nor is talking about race the same, right? And we're not trying to divide people in that. And so, just last month, the president issued this executive order forbidding the use of diversity trainings because diversity trainings and talking about diversity is divisive and un-American. So the president is currently speaking to this idea. And I'm just wondering, how do we confront this?
So for a couple of decades, I thought the biggest hurdle we had to overcome was this dynamic, what we can call color blindness, right? So there was a progressive version of color blindness, and the progressive version of color blindness said, this was the version of it articulated in Plessy versus Ferguson, the version of it articulated by Thurgood Marshall when he was litigating the cases attacking and ultimately overturning Jim Crow segregation. Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund said the law ought to be colorblind, by which they meant government ought not to use race to oppress people. But very quickly, indeed as early as 1955, once the Supreme Court declared state-sanctioned segregation illegal, conservatives turned around and said, okay, well, now that we can't oppress people formally on the basis of race, let's reinterpret colorblindness to mean you can never talk about it. Not that you can't use it to oppress people, but rather this unbelievably broad claim that colorblindness means you can never talk about it, and that racism is any notice or discussion, any direct reference to race, right? And this is Clarence Thomas saying he can't tell the difference between Jim Crow and affirmative action. That only makes sense when you use this reactionary form of colorblindness that says racism is the mere notice of race. Jim Crow, which suppresses and humiliates African Americans, and affirmative action, which seeks to integrate our society, both of those surely notice race, but it does seem like anybody older than, let's say, 4, maybe 2. Yeah, let's say older than 2. Anybody older than 2 ought to be able to make the distinction between, inflicting pain and bringing somebody in, but Clarence Thomas can't. He just can't fathom that difference, right? That's the play, and that's what Donald Trump is doing right now. He's continuing to trade on color blindness. But something really different has happened. Because of Donald Trump, because of dog whistle politics, over the last decade, most whites have shifted beyond color blindness. So there was, from, let's say, over the 80s, the 90s, into the mid 2000s, a sense among many whites that it was morally wrong to ever mention race. And they developed a sort of an etiquette of like, I never notice it. How can I be racist? I'm colorblind. Okay. That doesn't exist among the majority of whites anymore. Ashley Jardina, a political scientist, I think she was at Duke, I'm not sure if she's still there, has done some really important work asking whites about how important white identity is to them. And you would think, if they were colorblind, they would say, white identity important to me? No, I never notice it. I'm colorblind. I would be wrong to think about it. But in fact, she's finding that somewhere north of 2/3 of whites are saying being white is very important to me, and I'm proud of the fact that I'm white. Right now, this is no longer colorblind. And Trump is actually stoking that sense among many whites that being white is one of their most important attributes. And now he's combining this with this colorblind attack on critical race theory and diversity inclusion, because what he's trying to promote is the idea that there's very little racism today anymore that flows from whites to people of color. But on the contrary, there's a tremendous amount of racism that flows from people of color, and more specifically from racial justice activists and their white radical enablers, that flows from them towards whites. And what is the form of modern racism that Trump wants to emphasize? The sort of racism that sees racism as something among whites, right? So that critical race theory, when critical race theorists say, we're a country founded in racism in which race remains endemic, that is supposedly the new racism, right? And so what Trump is trying to do is he's trying to tell a story to whites that says, hey, white folks, you are locked into conflict with people of color. And part of that conflict is that people of color think you're racist when you're really not. And that makes you the actual victim of racism, not people of color, but white folks.
So where do we go from here? I think this is a great segue to going back into talking about merge left and how to construct these narratives, right? Because I think that's a key way to move from this talking about race is racist and how to make sure that race is at the forefront of all these issues, because it's so important in society and has been weaponized so much for all of these goals that you have been talking about. And so maybe we can just come back to merge left and just to tell the audience a little about what the basis of the studies was, and how you came to this idea, as well as some of the messaging that you used in this project.
Let's talk about how you don't win.
Oh yeah,
right?
We can start there.
Let's start there, right? So I've been saying, hey, dog whistling starts in 63, 64, Richard Nixon in the 70s. Another way of saying that is, hey, Republicans have been doing this for half a century. What is it that Democrats have been doing other than losing? So
question of the day,
right? And okay, so just as Trump wants to attack critical race theory for supposedly impugning whites as racist when they're not, Trump wants progressives to call him Donald Trump a racist. If you've been watching a lot of the Trump ads against Joe Biden, they really emphasize that Biden at one point described Trump's repeated references to the China virus as xenophobic. And, Trump keeps mentioning that and mentioning that and mentioning that. And I think a lot of progressives would stop and say, well, why is he mentioning that? It was xenophobic. Why is he bragging about it? He's not bragging about it. He's drawing on one of the core attributes of dog whistle politics, which is that it stokes these racial fears, but does so in code. And the code allows people to tell themselves that Donald Trump isn't being racist and that they aren't being racist, right? So, a lot of people are saying, well, the virus did arise in China. Um, uh, of course I support law and order. Of course I don't want to let rapists or murderers in. Of course I don't want to be blown up with a terror by a terrorist. None of that's racism. That's just common sense, right? And as progressive, we might step back and say, listen, those terms are designed to trigger racial fears. They are. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying in the people in whom those fears are triggered, they don't understand their reactions as, hey, I support white dominance. They understand their reaction as, hey, this is just common sense. Of course, I'm worried about terrorism and murderers and rapists. And just to emphasize this point, when we tested these messages, we found that levels of agreement with these dog whistle racial fear messages were almost exactly as high among African Americans and Latinos as they were among whites, right? And so likewise, majorities of Democrats find these messages convincing. Majorities of union households find these dog whistle racial fear messages convincing. It's a big mistake to think that the only people who agree with the sort of rhetoric that Donald Trump and Republicans use are, closet Klan members who know themselves to be racist and who recognize in the code as a sort of a secret handshake of another fellow closet racist. That's not what's happening. Instead, racial fears are being triggered, but using language that convinces most people it's actually common sense. So now, when progressives turn around and say, hey, Trump, when you say that stuff about rapists and ban all Muslims, you're a racist. Trump is thrilled, because what he does is he then turns around and he says to his voters, see, they're saying I'm a racist. They're saying you're a racist too. But your fears are just common sense. You're not a racist. And now you also know you're the real victim of racism, a victim of racism by these extremist people of color and their radical white enablers, right? Now, that dynamic in which calling a dog whistle politician a racist was quickly turned against the Democrats. That dynamic was clear to Democrats as early as 1970. So then from there, they learned the wrong lesson. Mm-hmm. They learned the lesson that since you couldn't call a dog whistle politician a bigot, they learned the lesson that you couldn't talk about race at all. And they went race silent. And I call this group the class left, because very often they say we need to assemble a big tent coalition, and the best way to do that is by focusing on something that unites all of us. Maybe it's minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. Maybe it's access to higher education. Maybe it's healthcare. But in any event, something all of us need. And so typically connected to class. The important point, though, is this class strategy is fundamentally also a race strategy. It's a strategy of staying silent on race. So here are the two main strategies that the left has pursued. You get the race left, the racial justice folks who are saying, hey, people like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, they're racist, and we need to call them racist, even if that alienates some voters. And then there's this sort of parenthetical, who are probably racist anyway, so what do we care if we lose them, right? So one strategy is, let's just go ahead and call this racism, even though we know that this makes it harder to build a winning coalition. The other strategy is to say, the class left, we're not going to talk about race at all. And here's a problem with that. The number one weapon in the class war that we're losing is racial division. That's the #1 strategy for Donald Trump, for the Republican Party. And so the Democrats are kind of responding like a basketball team that looks out on the floor and says, oh, you know, the best player on the other team, that's racial division. Our strategy is to ignore that player, leave that player unguarded, and we'll focus on these other players. And it's like, well, how's that going to work out for you? That's their #1 player. You can't let that person run the floor. Those are the two strategies, and well, we could trace versions of it even in 2020. But the key insight here, and here I'll pivot to merge left. The key insight here is those two alternatives, either call the dog whistle politician a racist, the racist call out strategy, or the class left colorblind strategy, those aren't the only two alternatives. There's another approach we can take, and it's an approach rooted in our initial analysis. Our initial analysis is saying racism is a class weapon. But that gives rise to a third way to build a multiracial democratic coalition, and that is to build a multiracial coalition that identifies race as a class weapon that threatens all of us. That is a coalition that fuses the issues of racial justice and economic populism, that doesn't try and talk just about race or just about class, but that talks about race and class fused together and talks about them together all the time.
So this is what you refer to as the race hyphen class, as opposed to the race and class approach, right? And you know, I'm wondering too, how other intersectional identities also fit or maybe don't fit into this race hyphen class approach. Like, is there any room for talking about folks who are trans, non-binary, people with disabilities, people from religious minorities? You know, I'm just wondering how we can make sure to draw folks in those communities in as well.
Great question. Let me go back to the race hyphen class versus race and class, just to clarify why I hyphenate them. Mm-hmm. Very often you see Democrats saying, hey, we have two strategies that don't really work well, the call out racism strategy and the ignore racism strategy. So why don't we do both? Right? Like you often see, you'll hear somebody say, we need to fight racism and reject racism to repair damage done to communities of color in a way that exaggerates the sense that white racism is the problem. They'll say that, and then you know, to a white, they'll say that to the black audience, and then to the white audience they'll say we really need healthcare, right? And so they're doing both. So that's race and class. Sometimes they do race, sometimes they do class. They're doing both. Whereas the approach I'm advocating is not do both, it's fuse them so that they're inseparable, so that you say to the racial justice community, racism is being used by powerful elites to scare society about people of color, and the only way to fight back against government violence against communities of color is to build a multiracial coalition that focuses simultaneously on racial justice and economic populism, so that we can have a majority big enough, a wave big enough to drive these dog whistle politicians out of office, right? Race and class fused together. And then a conversation with the economic populists. And you might think of this as the sort of Occupy movement or the Bernie folks that says to them, hey, we're engaged in a class war. The economy is rigged. You're so right. We need economic populism. But here's the truth. The main weapon in that class war has been racial division. And you can't build a 99%, a true 99%, unless you address racial division and work forthrightly to create cross-racial solidarity. The only way to achieve economic populism, and this also applies to the environmental context, the only way to avert climate collapse is to address racial division as the main weapon of the rich against all of us, and to build a multiracial economic populist movement, right? So again, like, I don't really care what issue you want to work on. If that issue requires government help to solve it, if that issue requires the government work for most Americans and not for corporations, you've got to simultaneously talk about the way in which power is using race, right? The power economic elites are exploiting racial division. So that's the race fused to class. Okay, now let me come to your question. Is it only race? Right? Does this apply to other status hierarchies? And there, I think the answer is, yeah, this isn't about race in particular. Or let me say that differently. This isn't fundamentally about race. This isn't fundamentally about hurting people of color or hating people of color. This is fundamentally about power. This is about how power organizes itself, defends itself, legitimizes itself, and then, contrary-wise, this is about how we build power among people to stand up to the power of the few, right? And so when we think about it in terms of power, powerful elites understand that in the context of a democracy, they cannot rule, they cannot run the country for their benefit unless they divide us against each other. Shattering social solidarity is their principal strategy. In the United States, because of our legacy as a country that is deeply racially stratified, the main way to shatter social solidarity is through racial division. But a very close second is patriarchy, and relatedly homophobia and xenophobia and religious bigotry. Or put differently, culture war politics. We see a sort of a very broad, very pervasive culture war politics in which ugly social hierarchies are constantly being stoked and promoted, constantly being prodded and jolted by Fox News, by Breitbart, by the Trumps. That is the effort of the powerful few to shatter social solidarity along any lines they can. And what that means is that if we are going to contest that power, if we're going to defend ourselves, if we're going to seek to build a society in which we all have dignity and all have the best possible chance to thrive, those are the lines of division we must purposefully bridge. Right? That becomes the prerequisite to meaningful action. Right? So now, having said that, I also want to be careful and be nuanced and say these various hierarchies work differently. The way power exploits racism is different from the way it exploits patriarchy, in part because whereas very few people understand themselves in the United States, something between 4 and 6% of people in the United States would identify as white supremacist, would say, yes, I believe in the superiority of the white race. Whereas when you look at the number of people who would say, I believe in the traditional family and that the man should be the head of the household and that women's highest calling is as wife and mother, that's much, much higher. And that means that patriarchy can often be advanced expressly without having to operate in code. Though you also get the sort of Amy Coney Barrett version, patriarchy being expressed in the form of a woman who is herself a professional and yet extols and validates the values, the patriarchal values. You also see this, it's pervasive in Fox News, All of these women in professional roles, very successful women, often very well educated women, but whose public persona is crafted around a defense of patriarchy.
So I think it's so interesting that you mentioned at the end there about the very well-educated women, because this was one of the refrains in 2016, right? About how it was, white college-educated women that were in part responsible for the success of Donald Trump in that election. And you talk about this as well, where we also have to look at those intersectional identities, because it wasn't just white college-educated women. So
Yeah, the most important intersectional identity there is the evangelical Christians, right? Like it's evangelical Christians, or white evangelical Christians, because this is not true of Black and Latino evangelical Christians, but white evangelical Christians are the most likely, the demographic group that has the highest levels of support for Donald Trump and for this version of racial fear mongering. What is going on with the white evangelical church? And it's a sort of a trifecta. Historians like Kevin Cruz have shown that business interests during the New Deal, so as early as the 1930s, began heavily investing in evangelical churches to encourage preachers to use the gospel to promote an idea of economic libertarianism, right? That is an economic ideology that was opposed to government regulation of the marketplace, as well as labor unions and collective action. So that starts as early as the 1930s. Then in the 1950s and the 1960s, as Southern schools are ordered to be integrated in many Southern communities, and then eventually Northern communities across the whole country, many white parents prefer to withdraw their children from public schools rather than have their children be educated in an integrated setting. And when they withdraw them, they put them in private schools, and these private schools were very often associated with evangelical churches. And pretty soon, a proxy language developed because the civil rights movement made white supremacy and open racism seemingly immoral, or seemed immoral in the eyes of many. Segregation was often defended in the seemingly neutral language as of a defense of the church. We're defending Christian schools. Well, those were segregated schools. Those were whites only schools. But they didn't say we're defending whites only schools. They said we're defending Christian schools. And then they moved to a more general Christianity is under assault. Well, in no way is Christianity under assault, but segregation is, right? So that was the 60s. But then you get the 1970s, and evangelical churches, which had been Protestantism, which had been relatively progressive on reproductive issues, where Protestants generally tended to support access to contraception and also access to abortion. That changes in the 1970s as evangelical churches begin, one, to resist racial integration, but then, closely related, begin to resist the feminist movement and begin to promote the right. And this is the sort of Phyllis Schlafly begin to promote the idea of a traditional household. And then Anita Bryant, the traditional household is not only patriarchal, but it's homophobic. And so now evangelical churches, as a sort of ideological / cultural matter, white evangelical churches are like the trifecta of pro-market, anti-regulation economic orientation, combined with a sense of whites being under threat and a defense of segregation, combined with a defense of patriarchy and homophobia. That's the kernel. That is the primary constituency for Republican politics today, right? And so, those are the folks who over decades have been encouraged to feel that they are under direct threat by a liberal establishment that A, believes government should work for working families, B, believes in equality between races, and C, believes in equality and dignity across genders and across sexual orientations.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for that explanation. I think this is so incredibly helpful. And yeah, I did just learn so much from reading this history that you lay out so clearly in Merge Left, also in Douglas and Politics. First, I just wanted to say that if folks have questions that are coming up for all of our attendees, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'd be happy to field those. I also, so just to drive home this point about the key differences in, so we started with the not effective messaging. And then let's talk about the key distinction between what's not effective and what is effective messaging. You know, just in this last 7 days before the election, you know, there might be some folks on this call who are you know, actively involved in doing, you know, the last minute text or letter writing campaigns. Like, what kind of language would you recommend to folks to use in these last several day efforts?
Yeah, great question. So I just put in the chat, and I think I sent it to all attendees. It says I did, but who knows?
Yes.
Raceclassacademy.com. So raceclassacademy.com is my effort to take these ideas and to distill them into a dozen very short videos, each building on the other, to try and explain, like, here's what dog whistling has done, here's how it operates as a weapon of the rich, here's the relationship between dog whistle politics and government violence against communities of color, here's how Democrats have tried to respond, here's why it hasn't worked, and here's this race class approach, and what it actually portends for building a multiracial economic populist movement, excuse me. But so I just want to recommend that resource to folks.
Mhm.
But to try and sharpen the distinction, say that we're trying to end mass deportation, right? And you know, and Trump and the Republicans are all the time talking about illegals and caravans, build the wall, and we want to respond to that. So one way you can respond to that is the class left version of responding to immigration, which is to say, we should talk about infrastructure, right? Like, we can't touch immigration.
Right.
Immigration is about racial fear. We can't touch it. Let's not touch it, right? And so you see that a lot, and you see this as sort of this, indeed, many centrist democratic organizations, that's their central advice, is to say, wow, you know what? Immigration and fear of immigrants is really effective. We can't name it. Let's try and change the subject to other things people might care about, like healthcare or minimum wage, or maybe we should just talk about the pandemic. That's the class left. The race left is more likely to say, you know, the immigration system reflects deep racism against Latinos and also against Asian Americans. Let's call it racist. I actually saw an immigrants' rights group that was trying to mobilize undocumented immigrants. And their slogan was, welcome to America, but America was spelled KKK, right? Like, their basic message is, welcome to a white supremacist society. Let's abolish ICE, right? And so this is a message that says, we really are locked into a battle between whites and people of color. And just emphasize this point, that's Donald Trump's message. But now you've got racial justice folks that say, yeah, we are locked into that conflict. Trump says, stand with white people. We say, stand with people of color, right? Stand against racism. And now, obviously, if those were the only two choices, great. That's what I was saying for years and years and years and years. That's what I said. We are a white supremacist society. Stand with people of color. Bad news is, when most whites hear that message, when most whites hear the message, hey, we're locked into conflict between whites and people of color, choose a side. Most whites do choose a side. They choose the white side. Here's the other bad news, which I didn't really understand. Many people of color do not want to choose the side of the oppressed and the subordinated. They want to choose a story of America in which they can reassure themselves they're not suppressed and subordinated, that racism won't be a major limitation in their life or in the lives of their children. And this is true of Latinos. It's especially true of Latino immigrants. People didn't sacrifice everything, give up everything, leave their families, their extended families behind so that they could come to the United States, so that they could say to themselves, I'll never be able to make it here and my children will always be regarded as inferiors. And when we try and mobilize them by saying, hey, welcome to America, KKK, people are like, that's not the country I came to. I'm going to make it here. I'm going to put my head down. I'm going to work hard, right? And so that message, and by the way, this is also true among African Americans. Like a lot of us who are progressive are used to talking to racial justice folks who've done a lot of work and who've done a lot of studying, very often in college, that makes us comfortable with an idea of a legacy of 400 years of racism, a 1619 project kind of framework, a rhetoric of systemic racism. But within our communities, most people are trying to make it day to day. And those concepts and those ideas are both unfamiliar and also overwhelming. And it turns out it's very hard to politically mobilize people by saying, we're part of the oppressed, we're part of the subordinated, the vast power of this society is arrayed against us, the history of this country is arrayed against us, the military, the political system, the economic system, the culture, Hollywood, all arrayed against us. Let's come together and fight back. Some of us do, that's the racial justice frame, but you can't build a mass movement that way. That's the race left approach. The race class approach is to say, we all across race lines are trying to do the best we can by our families. We share values. We share a common identity. But powerful elites are trying to divide us, especially, but not exclusively, by race. If we really want to take care of our own families, we need to come together across race lines and demand that government work for all of us. Right? That's the race class approach. And what the race class approach is doing is it is shifting the enemy. The enemy is not your neighbor. The enemy is not the person who's different from you because of their skin color, where they came from, their accent, whether they have papers or not. They're not your enemy. The enemy is the powerful few who are trying to divide us. In shifting the enemy, it also shifts our allies. Who are our allies? The 99%. All of us across racial lines. We're not on our own in our little embattled communities trying to fight overwhelming power. We are the 99%, but only when we build those connections across race lines, right? And so, and the last thing that the race class message does that I think is so important is it reveals that the idea of communities of color as undeserving or as a threat, that's the lie, that's the con, that's the game. So many times progressives are caught debating just how dangerous communities of color are, right? Some of us are good, not all of us are criminal. A lot of us have paid our dues, we've done our time, we're no longer a threat, we've aged out, whatever, right? Whereas a race class approach says, that's the big lie that hurts every family, white families too. The big lie is that people of color are somehow fundamentally different than anybody else, fundamentally more dangerous, less deserving. And that only when we reject that lie can we come together and take care of each other. Now, I actually tested those messages around immigration. And what I found was the racial fear message, we need to crack down on illegals, convincing to majorities of whites, Latinos, and African Americans. The class left message was unable to beat that dog whistle fear message, the colorblind one. The race left message lost especially badly among whites because, hey, shocking news, white people don't like being called racist, right? So whereas the race class, we all move in order to take care of our families. Some politicians are trying to divide us so they can distract us from their corruption. We need to reform the immigration system so that we can make sure government works for all of us, white, black, and brown. That message was more powerful, more convincing than all three of those other messages. And indeed, more convincing among Latinos, more convincing among African Americans. And importantly, that's the only immigration reform message I know of that won among whites over the dog whistle fear message outright. Like all the progressives are saying we can't talk to white folks about immigration because we can't touch it, as their racial fear is too powerful. It's like a race class message that says, hey, dear white folks, all that scapegoating of immigrants is actually hurting your own white family. Let's reform our immigration system and take care of each other. And that's the way you help your white family. That beat the dog whistle racial fear message against immigrants.
And you're saying that this was true, that it won across not only these racial groups, but also across the political spectrum too, right? Like of people in different camps.
Progressives and persuadables. And progressives are about 20%, persuadables are about 60%. There's another 18 to 20% that, you can call them opposition or the reactionary folks. They truly don't like people of color, hate government, love the rich. We don't convince them, but it's also important to recognize they're operating under the Fox News worldview. People of color are the threat. Government coddles them, and we hate government. The rich are rich because they just worked harder, and if you just work hard, you'll be fine. That is the opposition worldview. We can't reach those folks, but we can reach the 20% progressive base plus big numbers in that 60% persuadable category. And that's the only way we get to the sort of wave elections that actually ends mass deportation.
Fabulous. Thank you for clarifying that. So we have a question from the audience here. So this person says, there have been historical debates on the question whether class and class power supersedes race in importance. You've suggested today that race may not necessarily be central, rather class and class power may be the context in which race, gender, and other social hierarchies are manipulated in the struggle for class power. Could you please expand on your viewpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's the way I would do it. I would back away from the class language. Let me resurface a point that I made earlier. The crux is power. The crux is power. How is power distributed, organized, justified, exercised, contested in society? That's the fundamental issue, right? So if somebody said, hey, what's really fundamental here, race or class? I would say power. And then I would say class and race are simultaneously material and ideological manifestations of how power is arranged, right? So the material manifestations, you'd say, well, class is real in terms of what we can look at, ownership of the means of production and distribution of wealth, and distribution of income and regional distribution of wealth, right? We can look at all of those things. But class is much more than that. Class is also the stories we tell that justify particular economic arrangements, particular distributions of wealth. Like neoliberalism is class. And I think it's a justificatory ideology that explains why massive wealth inequality is okay. And in fact, government ought to be organized to facilitate economic inequality, to facilitate the upward siphoning of wealth. So class itself is already a way to explain and justify and rationalize particular distributions of power. So is race. So race has both material dimensions, right? Like you organize a society in terms of a racist hierarchy for 400 years, and it will have dramatic material consequences. Our institutions, our geography, the complexion of who's in power, right? All of that are the material manifestations of race. But on top of that, and inseparable from that, race is also operating as a set of ideas about who's deserving and undeserving, who's innocent and hardworking and built this country, who's lazy and threatening and an invader and a perpetual foreigner. And now I would say, okay, well, is the question in the United States which is primary? And I would say, look, because what we're talking about is the way in which power organizes and justifies itself, in the United States, neither race nor class are primary because they're inseparable. Capitalism and racism arise together in North America in the context of colonialism, and one cannot arise without the other, and one would not have the current shape it has without the other. And so when I say racism is the primary weapon in the class war, the rich are winning, I don't mean so class war is the real deal and race is just on the side. I actually mean racism and class war are inseparable in the United States. They have been since Bacon's rebellion in the 1600s. They have been since the fusion movement among the newly emancipated African Americans and working class whites in the South immediately after the Civil War. Racism and capitalism have been fused, were clearly fused in the mind of Martin Luther King, which is why he put together the Poor People's Campaign. They are still fused. This is not necessarily true in other countries. In other countries, they have different historical and cultural contexts. One may be primary over the other, or you may have, as in India, it may be caste more than race. So I don't want to get hung up on like the race, class, caste thing. I want to say what is fundamental? The question of how power is wielded in that society, how it becomes concentrated, how it becomes, how society can disperse power. That's the fundamental question. And then these other things like class, like race, like caste, like patriarchy, become expressions of power.
Excellent. So we have another question from the audience here too. So where do you see Latinos fitting into this story in 5 or 10 years down the road?
I see them fitting in under Project Juntos .us. Cool. So that's projectjuntos.us. So I just, you know, one thing that's important to say that I haven't said so far is, listen, after I published Dog Whistle Politics in 2014, and I had this sense of like, oh, wait a minute, there's this third way. And I started talking to unions in particular, and the union said, great, love it, give us proof. So pulled together actually a former student from Berkeley Law, who was at that point running a think tank that was working on racial and economic justice, Heather McGee, a major polling firm, communication specialist. We did this major research project to test these messages and also to test the efficacy of a race class response. So that was in 2017, 2018. And then just this year, sort of spring and through midsummer 2020, I ran another major research project to test how to talk to Latinos about dog whistle politics and how to build support for a multiracial multiracial progressive coalition. Interviewed 1,145 Latinos across the country, ran 15 focus groups with Latinos all over the country. In addition, did samples of 400 African Americans and 400 whites to make sure that a message that politically mobilized Latinos also was encouraged participation in this multiracial coalition. So Project Juntos is where that research exists. Here's the bottom line, and it's a sort of you know, it's a little bit, it challenges a lot of Latino organizers, but it actually has a very hopeful bottom line. most of us think that the way, have thought, I certainly thought this, but many Latino progressives think that in order to mobilize Latinos need to be part of a coalition of people of color. And the challenge is that you have to convince Latinos they are people of color. And you can see this in, for example, the Chicano Power movement. That was one of their big agendas, is consciousness raising that was saying, hey, we're not an ethnic group. We're not a white group. We're brown and we're proud. Likewise, young lords, also consciousness raising, trying to get people to understand that we're people of color.
Mhm.
When we ran our survey, only about a quarter of Latinos were disposed to identify as people of color, and about 60% rejected that identity. And that 60% was split between those who said they were white and those who said, race isn't that relevant to me. You know, I'm just going to put my head down and work hard. But what's important there is about 60% of Latinos were saying, I don't want to be part of that people of color group, right? So that's a challenge to progressive Latinos. But here's the good news. When we said to Latinos, we celebrate our differences, but some people are trying to divide us because when they succeed in dividing us, they can run the system for themselves. We're going to celebrate our differences and build power with other groups so that we can make sure that all of us are taken care of. That was overwhelmingly popular, no matter how people conceptualized their racial identity, whether they thought they were a people of color or white, or that race didn't really matter to them. And so here's that bottom line, and just to really emphasize it. We can't really convince a majority of Latinos that they're people of color. It's too heavy a lift. But no matter, because we can very easily convince a majority of Latinos that they should celebrate differences, reject attempts to divide us, build bridges with other groups as the clearest, as the most practical route to build power and take care of their own family. And that's the real agenda, right? And I think that it's also, in some ways, I think that's the, we need to shift our gaze a little bit. What is our real agenda? You know, not like, you know, what works or what doesn't work, or like, if we could do anything, what would we want to do? And I think my number one agenda is encourage people to see themselves in each other's eyes, to take care of each other, to reject purposeful attempts to divide us by the powerful few, and instead to build power across all groups so we can take care of each other. Like, that's what I really want to do. So now it also turns out that's the best way to respond to the actual threat we face, which is divide and conquer. And it's also the most powerful, most persuasive political message available right now. We don't need to convince people that they're people of color or that white racism is the main problem. We don't need to do that. We should, and we can convince people that we share a humanity, that our fates are linked, that some powerful interests intentionally try and divide us, and that in the face of that, we must unite and build power with each other. That's what we ought to do, and that's what we can do.
So I think this is a fabulous note to end on. You know, I just keep thinking about the election next week, and it seems that your call to action stands no matter what happens next week. We have our marching orders in joining together this race class narrative and drawing people in order to build more of this cross-racial solidarity that we've talked about today.
Yeah, let me just emphasize that really quickly.
Yeah.
This message is politically powerful in the sense of like, hey, you can use this for the election. But it's also a major shift in how we think about where to take our society. And in that sense, if the powerful few have spent 50 years purposefully shattering social solidarity, we are going to have to commit to building social solidarity for decades. This it's not just a short-term political message, it's a medium-term political project.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Ian. This was absolutely fabulous. And thanks to the organizations that hosted this event, and to CESAT as well for introducing. So this will be made available, I believe, through iRise's Facebook page, and then the recording will also be posted online. So yeah, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Tanya. I really appreciate it. Take good care.
All right, you too.